Hello, friends. Today, we will uncover a secret. The secret of inflation that no one ever talks about. On an ancient coin unearthed by archaeologists near Rome, there is an emperor. His profile is stern, the engraving is sharp, but if you hold it in your palm, you immediately realize something is wrong. The coin is light, too light, as if it were hollow inside. And this is not the craftsman's mistake. This is the result of a policy that literally devalued the empire. You most likely didn't even suspect that the fall of the Roman Empire was linked not only to barbarians, not only to wars and crises. One of Rome's greatest traitors was its own silver. The denarius, the pride of the Roman economy, eventually turned into a mere scrap. And this became the first great story of inflation. It all began innocently. The first denarius, introduced back in the Republic, was almost pure silver, a sturdy coin trusted by merchants throughout the Mediterranean. You could pay a legionary with it, buy bread, or pay for a caravan from the east. But over time, the empire's appetites grew. Wars required money. Roads required money. Spectacles for the people also required money. And the emperors found a simple solution: dilute the coins. At first, just a little. They mixed copper with silver, reducing the precious metal content by a few percent. People didn't notice. The coin looked the same, sounded the same, but the seed was planted. With each new ruler, the silver content decreased. By the 3rd century AD, the denarius was almost a copper coin with a silver coating. And that's when panic began. Merchants stopped trusting the money. In markets, they demanded more coins for the same basket of bread. Legionaries, more pay for the same service. The state responded by issuing new money, even more diluted. A vicious cycle. This was the first inflationary spiral recorded by history. An empire used to hard currency suddenly found itself trapped in its own manipulations. People began hiding old, heavy coins and refused to accept new ones. Prices rose. Trust collapsed. Notice the paradox. The world's strongest army was defeated not by barbarians, but by its own purse. The barbarians merely finished off what the economy had been destroying for decades. When money stops being money, everything collapses. And here we see the first lesson. Inflation is not just rising prices. It is a crack in trust. When people stop believing that tomorrow the coin will be worth the same as today, the empire falls. But history did not end there. After Rome, coins did not disappear. On the contrary, they became an even more desirable tool. In medieval Europe, coins were minted by kings, bishops, and princes, and very quickly they repeated the same mistake as the Roman emperors, because greed is always stronger than memory. Kings began to trim coins, literally. They cut off the edges, remelted the metal, and minted new ones. People noticed. The weight decreased, but the price did not. And once again inflation began. Only now, under the ringing of swords and the thunder of fortress walls. So pay attention. Rome fell, but its disease was inherited by the kings and feudal lords of Europe. And it was there that inflation acquired new, cunning forms. And so we leave Rome in ruins, coins with a thin silver coating rattling in merchants' leather pouches. And new masters of money take the stage, European kings, the Middle Ages. One would think that Rome's lesson was fresh. Tampering with money is dangerous. But temptation was too great. Wars with neighbors, crusades, feasts, castle building, all this cost insane amounts. And where to get it? Of course, from the coin. Kings realized a simple thing. A coin is not only metal, it is trust. If my face and coat of arms are stamped on it, people believe it is worth what I say it is. That meant the game could begin. They started issuing coins with less silver or gold content, but with the same nominal value. Old coins were withdrawn, new ones minted. The people accepted them because they had no choice. One of the most famous tricks was the so-called scissors. Imagine a medieval merchant. He picks up a coin and suddenly sees that its edges look trimmed. And indeed, government minters literally shaved thin strips of precious metal from each coin, remelted them, and minted new ones. Thus, the treasury gained extra metal, and people got lighter, devalued money. The effect was predictable. Prices rose. A sack of grain now cost not 10 coins, but 20. And again, discontent, riots, rumors. In London and Paris, crowds of peasants and townsfolk complained, "The king is robbing us." But the king could not stop. Because the army demanded pay, wars needed supplies, and the treasury was empty. And here's what's important. In the Middle Ages, inflation first became not only an economic phenomenon, but also a political weapon. Kings played with coins to hold on to power. But the more they played, the less people trusted money. And then new heroes appeared on the stage, the alchemists. The alchemists promised a miracle, to turn any metal into gold. Kings dreamed that this would solve all problems. After all, if gold could be created endlessly, why fear inflation? But the miracle never came. Gold did not increase, but counterfeit coins did, multiplying each year. Forgeries spread, trust collapsed. Thus we smoothly enter an era where inflation ceased to be only a problem of kings. It became a problem of society. In every purse, in every marketplace, people asked the same question. But how much is this coin really worth? And at this moment, Europe first encountered the idea that money might not be just metal, but an illusion that lasts only as long as people believe in the king's portrait. But all this was only a prologue. The true revolution in money was brewing not in Europe, but in the East. There, for the first time, a daring experiment was attempted to abandon metal and trust paper money. Light, convenient, like the wind. But it was they that turned into ashes the fastest. And so, in the stone castles of Europe, kings were cutting coins with scissors, while in the dungeons of castles, by candlelight, other figures were at work, the alchemists. In their eyes reflected the fire of furnaces. On their tables stood vials and retorts, on parchment, strange symbols. But if you strip away all the mysticism, the main goal of these quests was painfully pragmatic: to find a way to print wealth. The alchemists dreamed of the philosopher's stone, which would turn any metal into gold. For kings, it sounded like a fairy tale, too tempting not to believe. After all, if gold could be created endlessly, there would be no problems with wars, palaces, debts. But the truth was different. Gold remained rare, and the illusion of multiplying it produced only deception. While the alchemists searched for magic, reality was already pushing Europe toward what could be called the alchemy of money. Counterfeiters multiplied faster than monasteries. They remelted, forged, poured copper, and coated it with a thin layer of silver. Markets were filled with coins that looked convincing, but were worth nothing. Inflation by that time had become almost a daily phenomenon. People got used to biting a coin with their teeth, weighing it in their hands, checking its sound when it fell. Money had stopped being a reliable instrument and turned into a lottery. Today, your coin might still be honest tomorrow, just a copper disc, shiny only on the outside. And here, an important turning point was born. Europe began to realize money is not metal. Money is trust. And this trust collapsed every time a counterfeit coin ended up in someone's hands. Let's take a step forward. If in Europe coins were spoiled by alchemists and kings, then on the other side of the world, in China, they decided to abandon metal altogether. There, a daring idea was born. Money could be made not of gold or silver, but of paper. Paper money. Flying notes, light as the wind, convenient for merchants. But every illusion has its term. And soon the Chinese dream of infinite paper wealth ended in catastrophe. Paper depreciated like autumn leaves. People realized that paper burns faster than metal rusts. Thus began the story of yet another cycle of inflation, on a much larger scale. Because if metal can be clipped with scissors, paper can be printed endlessly. And so we move from Europe's dark basements, where alchemists futilely boiled gold, to the sunlit streets of China during the Tang and Song dynasties. Here trade thrived, caravans stretched for miles, markets rang with coins. But along with wealth grew one serious problem. Metal was too heavy. Imagine a merchant hauling sacks of copper coins across mountains and deserts. The risk was huge, the pace slow. And then in China, they dared to attempt a revolution. They invented paper money. At first, these were promissory notes. A merchant would deposit coins in a safe place and receive flying money. Thin paper receipts that could be exchanged back. They were light, convenient, easy to hide in a sleeve. And the idea worked. Merchants were delighted, deals sped up, trade revived. Paper turned out to be more practical than metal. But where there is paper, there is temptation. The government saw, why limit ourselves? After all, paper can be printed as much as one wants. And they began issuing more and more of these notes. At first it seemed like a miracle. The treasury was full, soldiers were paid, roads were built. But soon the same thing happened, as always. There was simply too much paper. Prices soared. A note that yesterday bought a sack of rice today bought only half. Tomorrow, a quarter. People began losing faith. In markets, they refused to accept paper, demanding metal again. Paper money, so proudly called flying, turned to ashes. The most tragic scenes were when peasants burned worthless notes to heat their stoves. Paper that only recently symbolized wealth had become fuel. A symbol of triumph turned into a symbol of deception. And here lies the lesson. For the first time in history, humanity saw that inflation of paper money could be far greater than inflation of metal money. Metal could be clipped, but paper could be printed endlessly. This idea, that the state could create money out of thin air, proved too dangerous. But don't think Europe ignored this experience. Their bankers and monarchs looked at the Chinese experiment and understood. Paper is the future, but a double-edged one. Because paper carries both the magic of convenience and the threat of catastrophe. And indeed, centuries later, Europe itself would dare to take this step, especially vividly during revolutions. Paper would again become a weapon, but now, not only of trade, but of politics. And the loudest example, the French Revolution and its assignats, which at first promised freedom, and later turned into scraps of paper you couldn't buy even bread with. And so we move to Europe at the end of the 18th century. Paris is noisy. Crowds are shouting, "Liberty! Equality! Fraternity!" The guillotine falls in the squares, and in the halls of the National Assembly, new laws are being written. The French Revolution is an explosion. But revolutions, like empires, always face the same question: where to get money? Gold was scarce. Silver was carried away by aristocrats fleeing abroad. War, reforms, the army, all of this required enormous expenses. And so the new government decided to follow the Chinese path, only louder and on a bigger scale. They issued paper money, assignats. At first, it looked like a miracle. Assignats were backed by confiscated church lands. Everyone who holds this paper actually owns a piece of France, the politicians said. The people believed. The banknotes were printed with pride, distributed, and used for transactions at markets. It all seemed right. Here it was, freedom, in paper form. But freedom quickly turned into deception. The government printed too many assignats. The church lands were not enough to cover them. People felt the trick, but it was too late. Prices began to rise. A loaf of bread required more and more assignats. Panic spread through the streets of Paris. Market traders refused to accept the paper, demanding silver or gold instead. But ordinary people no longer had them. Inflation collapsed upon the nation like an avalanche. Paper devalued before people's eyes. Images from that time are striking. People carried baskets of assignats just to buy a sack of potatoes. Children played with the notes like candy wrappers. What only recently seemed to be a symbol of revolutionary victory became garbage. And here lies the paradox. The revolution that promised equality and justice, through inflation, produced even greater inequality. The rich managed to exchange assignats for real goods or land. The poor were left with piles of paper worth nothing. It was precisely this catastrophe that became Europe's lesson. Paper money is a convenient tool, but if abused, it turns into a weapon of self-destruction. France in the late 18th century learned this the hard way. But history did not stop. A century passed, and in the 20th century the world once again witnessed catastrophic hyperinflation. This time, in the heart of Europe, in Germany. Their paper stopped being money so quickly that people stoked their stoves with marks and paid for bread with suitcases full of banknotes. And so we move to Europe of the 20th century. Paris has long been living under the Eiffel Tower. The revolution has become a page in the history books, and a new drama unfolds in Germany. The year is 1923. The streets of Berlin, Dresden, Hamburg, are full of people who no longer believe in their own money. For the German mark, the very one that after the war was supposed to become a symbol of revival, had turned into paper, used to heat stoves. After the First World War, Germany was left in debt, reparations, a ruined economy, political chaos. The treasury was empty, while bills piled up, and the government decided to take the simple path, turn on the printing press. At first, cautiously, a little, but appetite grows with eating. More and more banknotes were needed, and soon the mark was devaluing every single day. People received their wages in the morning and rushed to the market, because by evening the same money bought only half as much. A loaf of bread was paid for with a basket of banknotes. Children played with stacks of money as if they were building blocks. Workers stacked bundles of notes to fuel their stoves. Money stopped being money. The scene seems absurd, but it was reality. A teacher who had saved his entire life suddenly found himself penniless. A pensioner could not buy milk. A worker could not feed his family, even though formally his wages were counted in millions. In this inflationary vortex, not only the economy collapsed, but faith in the state itself. And here appears the most dangerous effect of inflation. It corrodes not only wallets, but morality itself. People stop believing in the honesty of authorities. They stop trusting each other. They look for a strong hand to restore order. And it was in this atmosphere of chaos that the popularity of radical parties began to grow. Germany remembered hyperinflation as a national trauma, and this scar became fertile ground for Hitler's rise to power. Inflation here again revealed itself as a political weapon, even if the authorities had not intended it. When money loses meaning, people are ready to believe anyone who promises to bring back order. And this is one of the most terrifying lessons of history. Hyperinflation breeds dictators. But the world did not stop with Germany. The 20th century continued to play with fire, and the next chapter unfolded across the ocean. America, the land of dollars, gold, and ambition. There, inflation manifested differently, not in suitcases full of banknotes, but at the moment when the dollar broke the chains tying it to gold. It was a shock that changed the world and made money into what we know it as today. Mid-20th century America looked like a victor. After the Second World War, it was the dollar that became the backbone of the global economy. The Bretton Woods system of 1944 enshrined the rule. Every currency is pegged to the dollar, and the dollar is pegged to gold. $35 per ounce, that was the unbreakable formula that inspired trust worldwide. Paper turned into metal, metal into confidence. It seemed as if history had finally found an anchor to keep money from catastrophe. But the anchor turned out to be too heavy. America lived richly. Wars, the space race, aid to allies, social programs, all of this required spending. Dollars flowed across the world like a river. Europe, Asia, Africa, everyone held American banknotes, knowing that behind them stood gold. But one day, the numbers stopped matching. There were too many dollars, too little gold. In the early 1970s, President Nixon took a step later called the shock. In a live broadcast, he announced, the United States would no longer exchange dollars for gold. The system that had held the world for almost 3 decades collapsed overnight. The effect was immediate. The dollar lost its anchor. From that moment on, money ceased to be something material. It was no longer metal, not silver or gold. It became a promise, a paper promise, backed by nothing. For the first time, the world found itself in a situation where the currency of the greatest power existed only thanks to faith in its strength. Inflation immediately reminded people of its presence. Prices in America shot up. The oil crisis, rising unemployment, protests. People felt, for the first time, the dollar was no longer the same. And the world realized that if even the strongest currency could lose its golden foundation, then no one was safe. The irony was that this step made the dollar even more powerful, because, freed from gold, the U.S. gained the ability to print money without restrictions. And the entire world became tied to this printing press. Inflation became global. Now imagine the contrast. In America, the dollar was breaking golden chains, while on the other side of the planet, in the Soviet Union, money looked as if it were frozen. Prices for bread, milk, sausage, fixed. It seemed there was no inflation. But this was only a phantom. The real storm would erupt later, in the 1990s, when the phantoms disappeared, and the ruble exploded in hyperinflation. America had already set the dollar free to float, while at that time in the Soviet Union reigned an illusion of immobility. Step into a grocery store somewhere in Moscow in the late 1970s. A price list hangs on the wall. Bread, 20 kopecks. Milk, 28. A loaf, 13. Prices did not change for years, as if frozen in time. People lived with the sense, we have no inflation. Wages were small but predictable. Rent was tiny. Transport cost mere kopecks. And in this lay the main myth of the Soviet economy. the myth of stability. But the truth was different. Inflation existed, only it was hidden. The state artificially kept prices down, subsidizing goods, covering the difference from the budget. And everyone felt this difference: empty shelves, endless lines, shortages. You might have been able to buy sausage for $2.20, but it simply wasn't there. Money in your pocket meant nothing without access to goods. This was hidden inflation, when what devalues is not the banknote, but the very possibility of using it. In the 1980s, the situation worsened. The economy was cracking, subsidies grew, goods vanished. People saved money but had nothing to spend it on. Rubles piled up under mattresses, turning into phantoms waiting for their hour. And that hour came in the early 1990s. After the collapse of the USSR, state control fell apart. Prices were freed. And the ruble, chained for decades by fictitious stability, exploded in hyperinflation. What cost 10 rubles yesterday cost 100 tomorrow. Wages devalued in a week. Pensions disappeared before people's eyes. Those who had believed all their lives in the firmness of the Soviet ruble suddenly found themselves in a world where it turned to dust. The images of that time are familiar to everyone. Grandmothers in markets with bags of rubles worth less than the vegetables in those bags. Factories that paid workers in goods, boots, pots to replace money somehow. Inflation showed its true face: terrible, merciless. And here it becomes clear. Inflation is not only about Russia or Germany. It is the sickness of the entire world. Latin America, in those same years, went through its own price explosions. In Argentina and Brazil, money depreciated so fast that people would buy everything immediately after payday, just to preserve some value. In Africa, countries like Zimbabwe would print banknotes with 12 zeros, which still weren't worth even a pack of cigarettes. We rise to the global level. The history of inflation ceases to be a set of separate episodes and becomes the shared drama of humanity. The USSR collapsed, the ruble turned to dust, and it seemed this was the worst scenario in history. But no, the world already knew examples far more terrible. One only had to turn the globe to see countries where inflation had become not a catastrophe of one decade, but a way of life. There, money truly burned, sometimes literally. Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Peru. Here, in the 1980s and 1990s, inflation became as constant a phenomenon as the heat or the passion for football. Imagine that you receive your salary on Monday and must spend it by evening because by Tuesday it is already worth half as much. People rushed to stores buying everything from sugar to refrigerators, not because they needed it, but because tomorrow the money would turn into scraps. Saving was meaningless. Money died before your eyes. In Argentina, the currency changed its name dozens of times: peso, austral, then again peso. Each new currency promised, "Now everything is stable." But it lasted for only a year or two, and then the zeros crept to the right again. In Brazil, inflation reached thousands of % per year. People laughed through tears. Prices in supermarkets were rewritten twice a day. In Peru, prices rose so quickly that entire neighborhoods lived by barter, exchanging a chicken for a sack of potatoes just to bypass paper scraps. And now let's flip the map. Africa. Zimbabwe. A country that in the early 2000s decided to run the printing press at full speed. The result? Banknotes, with a face value of 100 trillion. Huge numbers, beautifully printed, but worth less than a bus ticket. People carried money in sacks just to buy a loaf of bread. In markets, money was weighed rather than counted. The bitterest sight. Money thrown into the street. Children played with it like candy wrappers. A banknote, which in theory should have been the pinnacle of human trust, became garbage. Shops refused to accept local money, trading instead for dollars, South African rand, for anything except their own currency. And here it becomes clear. Inflation is a global demon. It can destroy an empire, crush a revolution, burn a country to ashes. It always works the same way. It destroys trust, turns labor into dust, and pennies into nothing. But it has another face: inflation as a weapon. It is not always born only from within. Sometimes it is launched from outside: sanctions, wars, economic blockades. Money becomes a bullet on the front line, except that it hits not soldiers, but ordinary people. And so we have walked the whole path, from the Roman denarius that grew ever lighter, to Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar notes that could be weighed instead of counted. Money always seemed an eternal symbol of value, but each time inflation proved the opposite. It burned coins, turned paper into trash, and showed the world. Trust is the only real currency. Today we live in an era where money has stopped being even paper. All we have are numbers on a screen. Your salaries, savings, loans. These are no longer the clinking of coins or the rustle of bills, but sequences of zeros and ones. It seems convenient. But isn't this just another illusion? Bitcoin appeared as an answer. Its creators declared, no inflation, no printing presses, only mathematics, and a limited number of coins. It sounds beautiful, like a new utopia, and millions of people believed. But it's enough to look at the price chart to understand. Bitcoin is also a phantom, only digital. Today it is worth a fortune, tomorrow half, the day after tomorrow. It soars again. It is not a cure for inflation, but its new masquerade. In response, governments invented their own version: central bank digital currencies. A digital dollar, a digital yuan, a digital ruble. Each government wants to control not only how much money you have, but also every trajectory of it. It seems like the new future. But haven't we seen this before? Romans clipping coins, Chinese printing paper, the French issuing assignats, Americans breaking the link with gold. Each time, the authorities promised, now everything will be stable. And each time, trust ended faster than the money itself. We live in a world where inflation no longer smells of metal and no longer rustles like paper. It quietly sits in our shopping basket when bread rises by 5 rubles. It whispers in central bank graphs when interest rates creep upward. It winks at us in news about cryptocurrencies promising salvation. Will the future be better? Or are we just changing the scenery while the drama stays the same? Will money disappear, or be reborn again in a new form? The answer we will learn later. But one thing is clear: the history of inflation has not ended. It continues right now, in your wallets and on your bank cards. If you enjoyed this journey, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really matters to me, because only this way will I understand that you want to keep hearing stories that won't be told in the news. And write in the comments which city you are from and what time it is on your clock. And now, let's take a pause. Money has always deceived us, and inflation was only the mirror of that deception. But ahead lie even more secrets, because history always hides its next investigation under the cover. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next episode.